place back in the early 1960s that required off-street parking even in historic buildings. So this is on Water Street near City Hall. That's a building with a 19-foot frontage in the middle. And it had been vacant for 30 years, basically since the parking ordinance was put in place. The building had been damaged by fire, torn down, so there was an empty lot there. But the ordinance required 7 off-street parking spots. And so nobody was ever going to redevelop that building. There's not enough room for 7 parking spots unless you go up like 5 floors, and then that's all you'd have. And so we repealed that. We actually kept a minimum. We said you had to have 1 parking spot, but it could be the one in front, the meter parking in front of the building. That way some of the aldermen felt like it was too radical to repeal the ordinance entirely. But as soon as we repealed it, then they started building this building that came in and added value to the other buildings around it. Instead of a missing tooth, the building was built. Another thing, in the 1950s, Milwaukee, in conjunction with the Wisconsin Highway Department, started doing setbacks on streets. Like this is National Avenue, which is a state highway. And the state wanted to widen it from 55 feet to 72 feet so that they could have extra lanes and a left turn lane and speed up the traffic. But they didn't want to pay all the money it would cost to tear all those buildings down. And so they just put a line along the streets and made all the buildings on this side of the street non-conforming uses. And therefore, if you own, like say that building that says National Discount, if you own that and you wanted to sell it, and you'd do a title search and you'd find that encumbrance on it, you couldn't really improve it because it was a code violation in effect. And so you couldn't expand it, you couldn't really improve it, you could repair it, and that's about it. And so gradually all the buildings on the one side of the street started to rot. And maybe after 30 or 40 years, they would have been able to just, buy the buildings for very little money and then be able to widen the street. So when I saw that, it first came to my attention is I knew the developer who had done this building that's set back here. That's a laundromat. And I went up to the developer. He came up right after I got elected mayor, and he was trying to, flatter me because, I was all of a sudden this important guy. And he says, "Hey, how you doing, Mayor?" I said, "Fine, except, I don't live far from that on 24th and National. You built that laundromat and you set it back from the street. It looks ridiculous. It's like a broken tooth. What the hell's wrong with you?" He said, "Well, Mr. Mayor, it was your zoning code that made me do it." I said, "Oh, okay. Let me think about this." So then we changed the zoning code. And this is another example where that didn't happen. There's this art store on Farwell in Milwaukee, and there was a fire. That building had been lost. It sat there for a while. We changed the ordinance. By right, the developer could come in and build he could have built a 3-story building. He decided to build a 1-story building. And there's a reason why he did that, which was related to a regulation too. Not our regulation, but a federal regulation. But retailers they're now willing to do things that are more urban, and they're willing to do things, if they're allowed to, that actually can be useful to a place like, say, downtown La Crosse, or even in smaller cities. Like Home Depot, believe it or not, this is Home Depot on Halsted in Chicago. There's no visible parking except for the metered parking in the street. You can go in the alley, and there's a big parking lot under the building. But a lot of people go to Home Depot in Chicago and they get deliveries. They don't drive a Dodge Ram truck in and pick up their television set or whatever. They have it delivered to their house, which probably doesn't cost them much more than just driving, be about the same. But anyway, this is what they're willing to do. Now, they're probably not going to do this in a much smaller city than Chicago, but they're changing the sizes of their stores, Walmart now has a smaller store for urban situations. They're changing their parking ratios. All of a sudden, they're trying to serve the urban customer. And that's good news for places like downtown La Crosse, or older neighborhoods that have a commercial street that hasn't done so well. That the retailers are starting to think a little bit differently than they did before. This is another example of a zoning code that really screwed things up. This is a bowling alley that's obviously empty. It had a huge parking lot. Back in the mid-60s, there's a professor at UCLA, economics professor named Donald Shoup, who wrote a book called The High Cost of Free Parking. And he traced the bowling alley parking ordinance to a city in Ohio. I think it's Fostoria. Anyway, what must have happened there was that somebody went to the city planner and said, how many parking spots for a bowling alley? And the planner said, 5. 5 per lane. So, you know, throughout human history up to that point, you know, you have a bowling alley, it'd be like a hardware store, it'd be like a barber shop, whatever. You might have parking spots, you might not. You know, they didn't have an ordinance. So you'd have a bowling alley along the street, you go in there, you bowl. If you wanted a bowling alley with more parking, maybe you go a little further out. Well, what they decided was you had to have 5 spots per lane. Now, there's only 4 people can play in each lane. You know, if you bowl, you know that. So they did 5, and they ended up all over the Midwest. You can see these things: Bolero, Bowladrome, Bowlorama, you know, in Kenosha, in Superior, Wisconsin, whatever. You can see these things, and they're failed real estate. And the failure was caused by trying to solve that problem with the parking ordinance. And so they weren't thinking comprehensively. They were trying to solve a problem that often doesn't exist. Well, it's changing now. This is the headquarters of Cisco in Santa Clara County, and they built your typical suburban office park with giant parking lots. And they do have a problem in Santa Clara in that nobody will let anybody build anything there anymore. They have NIMBYs, not in my backyard attitudes around them. And so the commutes for people who live there, they sometimes have to commute 50 or 100 miles away in order to get to work. So they decided to do something about it, line their parking lots with condos and townhouses and so forth. And so that's what they're doing at the Cisco headquarters. They're basically making it more like a city, where you have offices and housing close together. Some people can still live, if they want to live 50 miles away, fine, go ahead and do it. But if you want to live in these buildings, you can do it and walk to work. And gradually it's just restoring. If you'd been in downtown La Crosse in 1925, that's what they already had. Another standard that is really annoying and has had a horrible effect is school site size minimums. And the National Association of School Facility Planners, they developed a standard in the 60s, 70s, 80s. They'd have a meeting every year and they'd try to raise their standards, have stronger standards, which meant requiring more acreage for schools. So those of you that are old enough to remember when you walked to school when you were a kid, like I lived in Rushville, Indiana when I was in kindergarten, 1st grade and 2nd grade, and 2 blocks away was my grade school. Well, Rushville followed these standards and they tore down that school and then built a school out in a cornfield with a giant parking lot. And now all the kids then had to be bused or driven by their parents to school. And that was caused by this effort to raise standards. Now, if they'd done nothing, some places would have done that anyway on their own. But by having the standard, they made it worse and worse. In Illinois, it's 5 acres for a grade school, 15 acres for a minimum for a middle school, and then 20 acres for a high school plus 1 additional acre for every additional 100 students above 1,000 students.